Welcome to Quick Bites, a video series brought to you by the Washington Hospitality Association, highlighting changes coming to the Washington State Food Code on March 1st, 2022. Today's video is sponsored by Harbor Food Service. Harbor Food Service is thankful for every opportunity to keep our industry moving forward. For other supportive resources, visit harborfoodservice.com, where we believe that life happens around the table. And now, here to discuss date marking is Susan Shelton from the Washington State Department of Health.
Great, thank you, Andy. So excited to be here again to talk a little bit more about some key changes to the Washington State Food Code that again become effective March 1st, 2022. Let's get started on our next one. It's a key component of the changes. It's date marking. Date marking is designed to control a bacteria called Listeria. It's one of the few that can actually grow in the refrigerator if you give it enough time. What's important is that it's going to be for cold foods. So it's only foods that are going to be stored in the refrigerator. So nothing on your shelves, nothing that you're going to keep hot. It's only foods that are stored in the refrigerator. On top of that, it's only foods that you're what we call ready to eat. They're stored cold and they're eaten cold. Also, it's what we call the TCS foods, those time temperature control safety foods. So it's not things like a mayonnaise that is actually not required to be kept cold for safety. It's going to be things along the lines of like cut melon. So a whole melon would not need date marking. A cut melon would need date marking. On top of that, it's going to be something that you prepare inside the food establishment or you open a container that you bought from a commercial food establishment. And then one last thing is something that you're going to hold for more than 24 hours. All of those foods need to be marked for what we call a 7-day service or discard. Again, it's called date marking. Key component here is date marking is for back of house. It's making sure that your staff are going through foods as quickly as possible and definitely within 7 days. So it's a kind of a first in, first out type of system. It's designed to ensure proper stock rotation. It's not something that you need to keep on the container to give to a customer. It's not designed to make the customer aware. One of the things to think about as you're going through and figuring out how you're going to mark your food is to figure out what kind of foods that you have to mark. So if you have things in your walk-in and your storage units, your cold storage units, you might be able to put a sticker on those. You might be able to use a grease pencil and mark on them, a permanent marker that you can actually mark on. It's any system that you want to use. However, here's the key components. Your workers have to use the same system and they have to be trained on it. So it has to be consistent. You can't have some workers using one system and another group of workers using a different system if they don't understand how to use both. Okay, on top of that, you also have to make sure that you can explain it to your local health department, right? Because you can choose whichever dates that you want to use. You might want to use a color. You might want to say a certain day of the week. So you want to make sure that you can explain. One of the best practices would actually be a written policy. It's not required to be written by the code, but that's a good practice because it'll help you make sure that you're able to train staff so that they're consistent, so they can review it if you're not there. Also, it's going to help whoever is there that can actually explain it to your inspector. Either the day that you make the food or the day that you open the container is day one. You can also freeze the food, and that'll extend the life, but it doesn't return it. It doesn't make it start all over again. So if you put something in the freezer, then you're going to mark it to say, okay, we froze it on this day, and then however long you freeze it. And then once you put it back in the refrigerator, it starts back. In order to get prepared for this, it's a really good idea to start looking through your cold storage units now. Figure out which foods, again, that this is going to apply to. It's really going to apply to items that are cold and you keep them in the refrigerator. So you really want to make sure that it's something that you're required to keep cold. So things like soft drinks are not TCS. You don't have to date mark those, right? So again, it's going to be food in your refrigerator that you keep cold and you're required to keep them cold. The next thing you want to look for is if it's ready to eat. So maybe you have raw meat in your refrigerator and that is a TCS food. You're required to keep it cold, but it's not ready to eat. You're going to cook it. Things that you're going to cook, you do not need to put date marking on. Then the next item to look for, do we keep this more than 24 hours? So maybe you just prepare something in the morning and you're going to serve it by the end of the day. You don't need to date mark that. However, you have to be really, really careful on that one to make sure that you are marking things because they might be stored in your refrigerator for more than 24 hours. Also, if it's going to be something in a container, such as a container of some maybe cream cheese, it's still in the container, that you don't have to mark that until you open it. Okay, so once you open the container, that's when you need to put the date mark on it if you're going to hold it for more than 24 hours inside your refrigerator. And then the last thing is we have quite a few foods that are actually exempt. So let's cover some of those exempt items in particular. First one that's exempt from date marking is deli salads that are prepared in a food processing plant. So if you get a commercial deli salad and you open those containers, they are not required to be date marked. Those are exempt. Also, if you have shelf stable USDA prepared sausages and cured meats, things like salami, pepperoni, prosciutto, they aren't required to be refrigerated. So those are shelf stable. Those also don't need to be date marked, even if you open the container. Shell stock, that's going to be your raw oysters, clams, mussels. Those are also, they technically could be ready to eat because you might serve them raw. However, they don't need date marking when you store them in the refrigerator. A lot of your hard and semi-soft cheeses will actually not need to have date marking. So things like your Parmesan, your cheddars, those do not need date marking. Those are what we call hard and semi-soft cheeses. Also, cultured dairy products are pretty acidic. Buttermilk, yogurt, sour cream, even when you open those containers, they are not required to be kept date marked. Preserved fish products. So this is very specific to pickled herring, dried or salted cod. Those items also do not need date marking. And then the last one is if you have packaged foods, you don't need to have date marking on those as well, as long as they're still inside their package. So let's talk about how to put it into practice, which items to mark and which ones you don't need to mark. Date marking, again, is going to be key for your TCS foods that are going to be kept cold and that are going to be either opened or prepared and served cold. So some examples would be milk, deli meats, soft cheeses like brie, feta, mozzarella. Soft cheeses also include cottage cheese, cream cheese, ricotta. Also, once you cut melons, tomatoes, leafy greens, they become TCS foods. So those are going to require date marking. Hard boiled eggs, because again, they're going to be ready to eat as is. And then sushi grade salmon also is going to be ready to eat. Even though it's served raw, it is going to be eligible for date marking because it is a ready to eat item. It is kept refrigerated, again, for more than 24 hours. These are items that don't need date marking, and yet they're very similar to the last list we just talked about. So buttermilk, again, it's acidic, so it doesn't have the same requirements. Shelf stable, which means it doesn't require refrigeration. Pepperoni, salami, hard and semi-soft cheeses, yogurt, sour cream. Again, those are acidic, like the buttermilk, they don't require date marking. Whole melons, tomatoes, heads of lettuce. Again, those are not considered TCS until they're cut. Raw shell eggs, because they're going to be cooked, and then oysters inside the shell. Even though those are potentially going to be served that way, they aren't required to be labeled for date marking. All right, so you can tell that there's going to be quite a bit of work to implement date marking. A lot of you are doing it now, but again, it's going to be something that you're going to want to make sure you go through your walk-ins, your menus to try to figure out which foods actually do need to have date marking. Figure out a system that's going to work for your staff, make sure they're trained on it, and make sure you can all explain it to your inspector. Again, this is a real key component for us to help us control listeria, which can cause a lot of illness and unfortunate lifelong debilitation with that bacteria.
Be sure to click on the link in the description below to register for our Quick Bites webinar on Wednesday, February 16th at 10 a.m., where we'll answer your questions about these upcoming changes to the state food code.